Buonasera e benvenuti a tutti. Welcome everybody. Non è il primo congresso che facciamo, no, di un certo livello anche numerico, eppure ogni volta è un'emozione nuova. Vi assicuro che, visto da qui, è emozionante vedere una platea di giovani, ma anche di professionisti già affermati, che hanno colto questa occasione che abbiamo costruito insieme di confronto, di incontro. L'incontro scientifico-professionale, perché il modello a cui facciamo riferimento è un modello molto aperto, quindi che non si rinchiude o non cerca autoassicurazioni con patentini e cose di questo tipo, ma trova assicurazioni in due cose: il metodo scientifico, le evidenze e i valori. E questo è un incontro importante che va in questa direzione di confronto con altri modelli che stanno lavorando insieme all'ACT, infatti si chiama di terza generazione, non è un congresso solo di ACT, ma di tutti i modelli che stanno lavorando in questa direzione, in questa nuova direzione. E quindi è particolarmente con grande piacere che vi do il benvenuto anche a nome del magnifico rettore della nostra università, che oggi non può essere qui perché è alla CRUI, alla conferenza dei rettori. By the way, la CRUI ha lanciato, non so se l'hai visto negli anni, un corso di public speaking che inizia così: non più mani sudate, non più voce tremante quando dovete fare una prestazione rivolto ai professori. Vabbè, anche la CRUI si vede che si è indirizzata, 650 euro peraltro. Vabbè, chiusa questa piccola parentesi nostra. Dicevo grazie al Rettore che ci ha dato l'opportunità di utilizzare le strutture di questa bellissima università e quindi lo ringrazio a nome di tutti i partecipanti. E poi, prima di lasciare la parola al Presidente dell'ACT Italia, Massimo Ronchei, vorrei ringraziare in modo particolare Anna Prevedini, perché in un momento difficile, anche per me personalmente, ha tenuto insieme tutta l'organizzazione veramente con uno sforzo veramente notevole. Grazie Anna. E adesso io subito do la parola a Massimo Ronchei.
Grazie professor Moderato, buonasera a tutti. Mi associo anch'io ai ringraziamenti ad Anna Prevedini da parte di ACT Italia, credo che sia stata in prima fila assolutamente nell'organizzazione di questo congresso, insomma, quindi vedere quanti siete è davvero fantastico, insomma. Quindi è un congresso che tratta di relazioni e quindi credo che, insomma, siamo in tanti a cercare di coltivare relazioni e rendere queste relazioni profonde e importanti. Spendo solo 2 secondi per dire questo. Stasera sono qua io come presidente di ACT Italia. ACT Italia annovera tra i presidenti prima di me amici cari come Giovanni Zucchi e ancora prima Giovanni Miselli, e spero a breve vedrà nuovi amici al mio posto, e credo che, insomma, Anna, Francesca Scaglia, che per ACT Italia è fondamentale, insomma, possano essere 2 persone che daranno il loro contributo, insomma. Grazie a tutti quanti per essere qui, e spero che possiate ottenere il massimo da questo tipo di esperienza. Do la parola a Nanni Presti, e ci tengo a dire che Nanni tiene alta la bandiera dell'Italia a livello internazionale, perché è il presidente dell'ACBS, quindi dell'associazione a livello internazionale. Congratulazioni ancora Nanni. Grazie a tutti.
E con le mani sudate, la voce e l'emozione e l'ansia, il piacere e l'onore di essere qui stasera. Volevo dire due parole per creare dei ponti. Sapete che la CBS sceglie un tema ogni anno. Per il prossimo congresso di Montreal, fra 2 anni, fra 1 anno e mezzo ormai, mi è stato chiesto, il Presidente sceglie il tema del congresso e io ho scelto come tema thriving, significa crescere, fiorire, sviluppare, ha diversi significati. Posso avere qualche domanda? Il significato più ovvio è una crescita biologica. Una crescita biologica è le occasioni di incontri. Quello che vedete forse. In realtà non ho detto chi sono, così almeno sempre perché. E questa persona qua è Sidney Bijou, che sta dietro, è un nome silente, nel senso che non compare spesso negli scritti ACT, nella Relational Frame Theory, eccetera. Però è un nome molto importante e ha influenzato tanto sia noi, me e Paolo, che anche Steve Hayes, perché è stato uno dei fondatori. Steve lo spostò da Tucson a Reno quando aprì il laboratorio e assieme a Cantor è stato uno dei fondatori. C'è il pensiero intercomportamentista dietro, il pensiero contestualista per come lo vediamo. Oltre alla crescita biologica c'è la crescita di un gruppo. Il ACT Italia si è coagulata un po' prima di quella conferenza che è stata nel 2011 in Parma. E questo gruppo è cresciuto a livello nazionale e a livello internazionale. È stata una conferenza importante, è stata una conferenza scientificamente valida, però anche nel gruppo ha creato tanto, ha coagulato un gruppo di azioni. C'è un gruppo più allargato, che è il gruppo IESCUM, che in qualche modo cementa, rafforza, amplifica queste cose, che ha una lunga storia ed ha celebrato anche i 100 anni dell'analisi del comportamento, diciamo stringendo i legami. Quindi la crescita può essere espressa a vari livelli. C'è una crescita nei membri della CBS a livello internazionale, siamo oltre gli 8.000 in questi anni, quindi è cresciuto tanto anche la comunità internazionale. La crescita della comunità internazionale corrisponde anche alla crescita dei fermenti. C'è una crescita nei membri, nei singoli paesi. Noi siamo, l'ultimo censimento ci dà all'anno scorso, non abbiamo adesso la membership nuova, ma l'anno scorso noi eravamo 166. Iscritti alla comunità internazionale. Guardate che presenti al congresso siamo 450. Quindi questo è uno stimolo a contribuire alla comunità internazionale. Potete contribuire iscrivendovi attraverso ACT Italia, perché attraverso ACT Italia entrate in automatico a far parte della comunità internazionale. Considerate che, per esempio, diventeremmo il quinto paese al mondo a dare un contributo come membri. Peraltro c'è una proporzione inversa. Gli inglesi, che hanno 745 membri, hanno fatto un congresso adesso a novembre a Edimburgo con circa 250 partecipanti. Noi che ne abbiamo 166, ne abbiamo qui 450, quindi sono ottimi segnali in questo senso. Ok, la diapositiva continua. C'è una crescita da radici che sono radici prettamente culturali, quindi l'analisi del comportamento ha dato origine alla Relational Frame Theory, che ha influenzato il modo come facciamo ACT. Però la crescita secondo me importante è una crescita intellettuale. Paolo ha parlato di evidenze. È lo spostamento del modello, dal modello post-hoc che anche la CBT di seconda generazione ha intrinseco, cioè la spiegazione dopo che funzioni la terapia, al modello ante-hoc, cioè noi riusciamo a spiegare in anticipo cosa potrebbe succedere, riusciamo a prevedere in anticipo, ma non solo la terapia. Abbiamo una unione, stiamo assistendo al fatto che ci sia una unione, un filo logico che collega psicofisiologia a psicopatologia, a terapia, alle componenti della terapia e ritorno. E questo è molto importante per l'efficacia sul paziente e il training che facciamo. E se guardiamo esattamente poi a quel modello, l'impatto è molto più ampio, va oltre l'ACT, qui è prevalentemente un confronto fra psicoterapie, ma l'impatto di questo approccio contestualista va oltre l'ACT, quindi non solo ACT, ma behavioral activation, FAP, andiamo sul nudging e le pratiche, i cambiamenti ambientali. Una parte della comunità CBS si occupa di cambiamenti ambientali. Abbiamo effetti sull'autismo, su come c'è stato un simposio questa sera, abbiamo effetti sul QI, training basati sulla relational frame theory aumentano di 20 punti il QI in alcuni mesi e recentemente abbiamo dimostrato anche effetti sui pazienti con Alzheimer. Quindi cresciamo anche culturalmente, ma vogliamo avere un impatto sulla società. Adesso vi do un altro numero. I followers su Facebook sono all'incirca 5.000 per la CBS. IULM ne ha qualcuno in più solo sulle proprie pagine. Ci siamo circa sui quasi 6.000 followers, quindi abbiamo molto di più di tutto l'impatto internazionale. Questo per darvi un senso di come è possibile crescere all'interno della realtà. Quindi crescita è quello che ci contraddistingue. Volevo anche io avere un'occasione per ringraziare Anna, per ringraziare tutti quelli che si sono impegnati. Ci sono tantissime persone che si sono impegnate anche a livello gratuito, anche le ragazze che sono le mie ragazze, le mie studentesse ed ex studentesse in segreteria che vi accompagnano. Volevo ringraziare anche loro. E se Steve è collegato? Steve, can you hear me? Ok, un grazie speciale lo volevo dare a Steve Hayes, che ci ha accompagnato su questa strada, che è venuto in forma promozionale nel 2006-2007 per iniziare la strada in Italia. Steve, can you hear me? I'm Nanni. I don't know if you can hear me.
Can you hear me?
Okay, hi. I'm going to introduce you. Okay, so before I introduce you, I want to have another look at my slide. Mi dà l'ultima?
And I'm going to need to figure out how to share my screen. I don't see the little symbol.
Ok. Steve è venuto nel 2007 in forma promozionale, ha dato un grosso impulso a quello che stiamo facendo adesso in Italia, a dove siamo arrivati. Quindi se c'è una crescita che ha avuto un impulso è quella di Steve. Se c'è una crescita che il cui impulso possiamo far risalire a una persona, a un promotore, a una persona molto energetica è Steve. E quindi da questo punto di vista mi sento di ringraziare a nome mio e a nome di tutti voi. E l'altra cosa fondamentale, volevo un attimino ritornare lì, l'altra cosa fondamentale è quello che ci tiene, perché molti di noi lavorano gratuitamente per la CBS, lavorano gratuitamente per IULM, tutto il board di ACT Italia lavora gratuitamente, quindi quello a cui noi teniamo moltissimo è questa cosa è resa possibile solo se crediamo ai nostri valori E uno dei valori fondamentali è appunto quella di cercare di cambiare il mondo con la scienza contestuale. Grazie. E adesso l'introduzione ufficiale di Stephen Hayes. Per me è molto difficile introdurre Steve, che conosco dalla metà degli anni '80 insieme a Paolo. È un onore e un privilegio.
It's great to have you back with us in Italy. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
It's an honor and a privilege to introduce you Stephen Hayes, a good friend of us, a good friend of mine, personal friend of Paolo, and friend of all the Italians in Italy. Steve was fundamental in introducing ACT in Italy. He has a great energy. You can't believe how energetic Steve is. And he also is not only energetic, but it's very, very, very incredibly smart. And so Steve is behind the ACT research, the relational frame theory research, ACBS, the journal, whatever it's energy that flows and get to us, and we are committed to really try to change the world. And so welcome back to Italy, and it's my honor and pleasure to say hello to Steve. Thank you.
Well, hello, my friends. It's very good to be speaking to you in Italy, my favorite country in all the world, maybe even a little better than my own. And I have a talk with too many slides, but it's a very simple message, and for ACT people, some of it is familiar. But I'm going to try to put it together in a way that maybe opens up some of the implications for what we're doing. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and let's hope that I've learned how to do this now. And if I've done it correctly, you're now looking at yourself. Not if that's true. Okay, good. All right, well then I'm going to go to my entirely too long talk. I think I can still hear you, so if anything happens technically, I would just ask that one of the moderators yell at me, and I'll, because I'm about to no longer be able to see you, and I'll just speak for 50 to 55 minutes, something like that, leave a few minutes at the end. Okay. We're in an era of evidence-based care. That's certainly true in the United States and in Europe. I'm sure it must be true in your country to a degree. But what that is changing. What it has meant in the past is that we were going to take the idea of organizing signs and symptoms into syndromes, and we will produce books and make progress. And we made a certain amount of progress, but I think more heavy books. We did the math. By 2050, there will be more sub-syndromes than people. Also, it has produced other lists, like all of these empirically validated procedures. And I'm very excited that we're the first 4 on the Division 12 list. But that's only because ACT starts with an A. I'm not sure this is really progress. And the world is changing because when the NIMH looked at this and asked, is it the best we could do, the same group that produced this by all the grant money and so forth, part of it was a worldwide thing 30 years ago, has now said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to give money only if you organize your ideas into processes that link to outcomes in these 5 categories, the research domain criteria. But that's still not a functional model. And we can't afford another major failure. We can't afford another 30 years of billions of dollars poured into a dead end. And if it's not careful, that's where we're headed. Because simply organizing all the processes out there into common sense categories, negative and positive variance, cognitive systems, social, etc., is not enough. We need functional processes and models that tell practitioners what to do and that produce desirable outcomes. An ACT contains such a model. It isn't just ACT. That model is in the entire third wave. All the work on mindfulness, compassion, values, metacognitive therapy, and so forth is converging on a model that is very similar to the overall ACT model. And I think what we're doing is we're redefining what evidence-based care is. That we're moving toward an idea where it means not protocols for syndromes, but evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures that impact the problems and prosperity of people. And I think we, as the behavioral wing, need to insist that these processes are not just measurable, but that they're changeable and that they have these qualities of precision, scope, and depth, that they moderate and mediate, and that there's evidence-based components to link them to, and finally that we can put this into personalized care and go back to the tradition of functional analysis in a new form, now with a way of dealing with cognition that allows us to say more specifically, what can we do to help the person who's in front of us? That is the vision of the third wave, I think. And it shouldn't be a surprise to you if you have been following it, because when that wave's arrival was declared 13 years ago in my presidential address at ABCT, I said it very clearly about what it is that we are trying to do. The quote is there for you to read. So we're going to move to evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures, and that's less like a design of a house than it is like knowing how bricks go together, and you can do many things with bricks depending on what our clients need and want from us. Evidence-based processes and procedures can go many directions, and that fits the personalized care model. Now, my own personal journey on this began in part inside my own struggle with panic disorder. I've told that story on my TED Talk, and there's actually a link there if you have not seen it before. And what that gave me from the beginning was a focus to this question, which is broad, which is, why is it so hard to be human? And the answer that we came to will make a lot more sense if you're new to the behavioral wing. Probably some of the people in the audience are. If you're interested in mindfulness and acceptance and compassion, you may be surprised to find that the behaviorists are there doing this work. It will be easier to understand if you think of behavioral thinking as a form of evolution science. We can summarize evolution science into just 6 words. When we're working with a client, we're trying to evolve a life, evolve a behavioral system. And evolution requires variation. If you do what you've done, you'll get what you've got. If you don't do something new, nothing new will happen. It requires variation. And from that, selection. You have to know what is moving you towards or away from what it is that you want. In biological evolution, that selection criterion is also life and death. But when we're dealing with the evolution of an individual, it's more complex than that. And we need to know how to retain those things in some sort of evolving system and to fit it to context. If we're going to evolve on purpose, it matters whether or not the context will support the new things we do. Not a good idea to wear a zebra suit in a lion park. And the dimension matters. This is a graphic of an epigenetic hanger-ons onto genes, methylation of cytosine. And it's an example of some of the dimensions. It's not just genes, it's epigenes, but it's not just epigenes, it's behavior and social learning and cognition and culture. And you have to do it at the right level. Things that are organized into more complex units have selection criteria that apply to that and to the simpler units at the same time. You have inside your body an ancient cooperative system in your nucleated cells. Eukaryotic cells contain within them a different life form. It's why you can spit into those little tubes and find out by the mitochondrial DNA what your mother's heritage is. And even after all of these billions of years, eukaryotic cells are still fighting. Mitochondria will trick cells into producing only females, in plants producing male cytoplasmic sterility, showing you that even ancient cooperative systems have to be concerned about the good of the group as well as the selfish interests of the good of the individual. Those are the 6 terms we need. Now, what are the biggest enemies of healthy variation and selective retention? And when I get up off the carpet at the nadir at the bottom of my panic disorder, thinking that I've had a heart attack, but realizing I've had just another panic attack. Look at my TED Talk if you want to see that story. I decided to put my energy into trying to understand verbal rules, because it seemed to me that's exactly what I had been ensnared by. The forms of restriction of variation that I could see that were most important were avoidance. We've known that in animal models for a long time. If avoidance occurs, behavioral development slows down because you avoid contact with the things that would lead to the evolution of new behaviors. But we had also learned in my lab and in others, and increasingly as we studied, we could see how powerful a verbal rule could be in producing relative insensitivity to the direct consequences of responding. And I could see in my own life, when you put those 2 things together, that it was especially bad. Following rules to avoid your own emotions or thoughts or memories or bodily sensations, we now know, is the most toxic psychological process in all of psychology in terms of the range and depth of the predictions it makes about distress, happiness, prosperity, and misery. As we explored it, we realized we had to understand what rules were, and we didn't have a good definition. We quickly realized that Skinner's definition wouldn't work because it wasn't a functional definition. And we spent several years trying to come up with an alternative way forward. That became relational frame theory. But if I look back at it now, I think I can talk about it in maybe a slightly more accessible way than I knew how to then. It's a very, very small skill. I think when I'm dead and gone, the idea of relational operants will likely be the most important thing I've ever put into the intellectual community. But it's a humblingly small idea, an obvious idea that lay in plain sight for 100 years and basically everybody missed it. It addresses this question of why a process that's only 200,000 years old, or maybe 2 million years old, it can't be much more because the branch that led to the chimpanzees don't readily do it, and your 12-month-old baby does. Why it impacts processes that are 500 million years old, such as operant and classical conditioning, or maybe even processes that are older than that, such as habituation. And the core of it is that language is not learned associations. It's not like the little tinker toys you see on that slide. That's what tricked the behaviorists and the cognitivists, the British empiricists and all the rest, and led to failure. Language is more like the picture you're seeing now. It's more like a family photo. If you look at these people here, if I told you this is an extended family, everyone in there is related, you'd have a very hard time knowing, even if you knew where they lived or who they talked to, necessarily how they were related. You can have people of different races and ethnicity related by marriage. You can have a young baby be the aunt of a much older person. You can have people who live together be distant cousins, and people who live far apart be in a long-distance marital relationship. The formal properties alone will not give you the relationships. But if you knew these people, if you knew who they were, you could relate every single one to every other one in a very precise way. You'd be able to say, how are they related? That's the model on which language was built. If I was there, I would talk about this by giving a demonstration. We started in our work with equivalence, and this very small skill that we found is not equivalence. That's not the point. It's learned relations. Very young children, if they learn to make a characteristic sound, let's say, in the presence of an object, and many animals do that, they will now, when you say the name, orient towards the object. And without training specifically on the item, we appear to be the only animal that does that. And we do it very young. And if you don't do it, you never develop natural language. This is a very small skill. It's so tiny that it lay there ununderstood until, I think, the relational frame theory folks got it much closer to right. And the core finding is this: it's learned relating, not learned associations. Why would we do that? Well, we're the cooperative primate. If you put a log on the ground, even toddlers will lift one up, one will lift one end up and the other will lift the other. Jane Goodall never saw a chimpanzee do that. They do cooperate, but we're far more cooperative. We reward cooperation. This picture of a baby feeding her little precious Honey Nut Cheerios to a puppet is significant, because a baby that old will know if they see the puppet be mean or the puppet be cooperative, that baby will feed only the cooperative puppet. Even before language, cooperation matters, because that's the kind of monkey we are. If you were to play with this baby, and then cleanup time came and you're putting away toys and you pointed at a toy as you were putting the toys in a box, the baby would know what to do. It would reach for the toy, pick it up, and try to put it in the box. But if another adult who hadn't been playing entered the room and pointed at a toy, the baby would pick it up and try to give it to the adult. even at this age, we have rudimentary theory of mind skills. We understand something about intentionality. And so if I was there, I would hold up an object and I would make somebody in the audience, perhaps Paolo, make a sound. And then I would repeat it. I'd hold up the object, maybe my clicker for my slides, and I'd make the sound. Then I'd throw the object out into the audience. I'd reach out for it, and I'd make the sound. I've done this demonstration many times, and always people give me the object. We have just done as a community what it is that is at the core of so-called stimulus equivalence. And that would happen even before there was human language, if we had reinforcement of cooperation, understanding of intentionality, and high levels of cooperation in early human development. Perhaps the hominids, perhaps Homo sapiens, but somewhere in that arc, I believe that happened. It's kind of embarrassing to be able to put RFT down into a little 4-line poem, but this is it. Learn it in 1, derive it in 2, put it in networks that change what you do. That's RFT. And that reach out and give it to me is to learn it in 1, derive it in 2. Once you're doing symmetry and mutual entailment, combinatorial entailment or networks come very easily. That's what we see in this picture, this gigantic network of thousands of relationships, if you listed them all, amid the 30 or 40 people here in this picture. Because it isn't just symmetry in equivalence, it very quickly becomes a model for other things. For example, if I was able to say, you're good for this task, I'm not so good, but George would be even better than you, I would be able to derive who would be best for the task. And in the same way, quickly we learn, as young children, by the time we get into kindergarten, that, for example, in coinage, value doesn't necessarily go with size. In American coinage, if I learned that a nickel was smaller than a dime, which physically it is not, that's hard for a 2- and 3-year-old. It's not hard for a 5- or 6-year-old, because they can derive that a dime is bigger, and if they've spent nickels, even if they've never spent a dime, they now want it. And that gave us the rudimentary problem-solving skills as we added these additional relationships. It also challenged our psychology, because it means there's nowhere we can go where our pain won't follow us. If we've had a car crash, the mere mention of the word car can be enough to produce a horrific memory. And we do this. If a nickel can be smaller than a dime, well then, no matter what your success, you can imagine something else would be better. And you can imagine a world, even by the time you're 6 years old, that would be better if you weren't having difficult memories or difficult emotions. And it's not by accident that 6-year-old children do commit suicide, but 3-year-old children do not. Because when you imagine a future that we'd be better off, it could even include one that we'd be better off with you dead. And so we've faced challenges from these basic relational framing skills. Now, why it matters for us clinically, cognitive relations are learned, and they're not going to be unlearned, because there is no such thing as unlearning. There's only inhibition and context sensitivity. We all know that from our Psychology 101 class, but the implications of it are, if you have a memory or a emotion or a thought you don't like, what you need to do is bring it under contextual control. It is never going to leave your repertoire. We've broken free of form. If a nickel can be smaller than a dime, which it isn't, then anything can be related to anything in any possible way. And that flexibility creates opportunities, but it creates challenges for us as well. Although this started as an extension of cooperation, please give me the apple, they're used dominantly now for problem solving, which means that this repertoire can easily change our lives from a process to be experienced into problems to be solved. So we need to learn to put, metaphorically, quote, our minds on a leash. And that's what we're trying to do in the acceptance and mindfulness and compassion wing of the evidence-based therapies. And that's what psychological flexibility does. We know that as an empirical fact, that it links to all of these procedures. It's not just an act-based process. It's not just manipulated by act. And indeed, that's a central theme of the paper from here out. Although I want to link this to act and the important work we're doing there, I think we need to be open to all the different methods that can move psychological flexibility skills. The ACT hexagon can be easily expressed if you can remember those 6 terms in evolution. The ones on the left, acceptance and diffusion, those are opening processes of taking repertoire restriction processes, such as running from emotions and avoidance, or entanglement with verbal rules, and creating more variability by looking at your emotions with a posture and thoughts with a posture of openness and with dispassionate curiosity. The central processes of contacting the present moment in a flexible, fluid, and voluntary way, from a perspective-taking or conscious point of view, those are all awareness skills. What they do is they situate us in context, both inside and outside, so that the variations that we come up with as we become more flexible can be fitted to the internal and external world, and then selected by the last set of processes, which are what are your deepest qualities of being and doing that you would choose if you had a choice, your values, and how do you bring your repertoire in alliance with that, creating larger and larger behavioral units of values-based action, essentially now using habit formation and skill development harnessed to the selective goal of values, and we'll call that active engagement. Those 3 processes of openness, awareness, and active engagement are in every one of the third wave procedures to a degree. All of them, to a degree, touch it both procedurally and in their theories. I don't think any of them do it quite as well, frankly, I'm sorry for the self-praise, as ACT does, because ACT was self-consciously a bottom-up, basically focused development strategy, and that was linked to evolutionary ideas as coming out of behavior analytic thinking, which has always been a wing of evolution science for those who thought in functional and contextual ways. That's psychological flexibility, all 6 of those things working together. And it turns out to be powerful. It's powerful in the community that's able to produce things, and it's powerful also in the places it's able to go. This is the little chart of randomized controlled trials, which is only one small link or one small window into the overall contextual behavioral science research program. But in the last 3 years, we've had a randomized trial about every 11 to 12 days. And 71% of our total knowledge has happened just in the last 5 years, since 2012. That rate of progress produces an enormous amount of information. And we have learned that other methods can change psychological flexibility, and that these methods are transdiagnostic to the max. We're not simply talking about a unified protocol that goes across anxiety and mood disorders. The ACT research and related methods goes across everything. Anywhere that a human mind goes, ACT and related methods can go and make a difference. Because psychological flexibility is not a theory of mental health. It's not a theory even of behavioral health. It's a theory of human functioning and how this evolutionarily recent phenomena of learned relating as a behavioral process interacts with processes that are thousands of times more ancient in learning and in our basic biology. So is psychological flexibility any better as a transdiagnostic set of processes than other popular ones, than self-esteem or self-efficacy or you name it? Well, I think the answer is probably yes, based on the evidence that is emerging. Part of that is because of the way it was built. But as an empirical fact, I think you can see it in the way that psychological flexibility and its components predict most forms of psychopathology and quality of life in children, adults, and the elderly, in virtually every area of life, and often does so better than those other known processes. This is a little example that I'm working with now. We published a piece in 2014 out of a data set in which almost 1,000 college students were followed with full blind clinical interviews for 4 years and multiple assessments of psychological flexibility and distress. The first report is just cross-sectional, but we've looked at this in a longitudinal way and it shows the same thing. And psychological flexibility predicts every major type of anxiety and mood disorder, eating disorders, lifetime substance use disorders, and on and on. Those are still significant even after controlling for the initial levels of general distress. Another high-quality study looked at more than 2,000 people over 4 years with blind clinical interviews and measures of psychological flexibility, the Spinhoven et al. Study. And psychological flexibility predicted the development of disorders, if you didn't have one, above and beyond baseline levels. And if you had one, it predicted whether or not later on you'd have two, how complex they became and how chronic they were. Psychological flexibility mediated the growth and clustering of disorders in this very large natural sample. We know that the separate elements of psychological flexibility appear to work as an area of measurement and as an area of treatment. The best example is an 18-year program by Lance McCracken in chronic pain, who took the early versions of the AAQ and turned it into the Chronic Pain Acceptance Questionnaire more than 20 years ago. Lance has now developed measures in all of the areas of psychological flexibility, even the perspective taking or contextual self, probably the hardest one, but also values, committed action, flexible attention to the now, diffusion, and acceptance. And all of those processes contribute to outcomes, and they contribute in ways that don't eliminate the other processes. They build on each other. And in these studies, you can account for nearly 30% of the variance in some of the samples, some of which did not include the newer measures, such as the contextual self. So we're over time doing a better and better job of measuring the components, And as we do, they appear to still be relevant and to work together to do a better job of predicting outcomes. We produced a meta-analysis. This is out of Mike Levin et al. I'm also an author on it, if you want to search for it. A meta-analysis of component analyses. And we found 66 component studies at the time, and they all predict outcomes when you target the various components of the psychological flexibility model. We know that psychological flexibility mediates the effects of most of the ACT studies where it has been looked. When I say most, all but one or two, when you have looked for it, the mediation tends to occur. We have nearly 60 studies like that. There's a list on the ACBS website. And in many of these studies, we've looked at other processes. Now, the mediation occurs naturally without intervention. You can take a sample and simply watch how things go across time or cross-sectionally and ask, for example, does cognitive reappraisal do a better job of predicting what's going to happen, or anxiety sensitivity, or coping skills? That's a voluminous literature, and the answer is psychological flexibility almost always does better. There's meta-analyses of the overall treatment effects, many of which get into the mediational data. There's not yet been a meta-analysis of the mediational data. Frank Bond has one that's coming, and we have one that we're doing as well. On outcomes, the meta-analyses, as you probably know, are quite favorable. We have a few sour notes, Lars Göran Ost's meta-analysis. We think that meta-analysis is unreliable. The data are flawed. And we have an article that we believe is now in press that will walk you through it. We found more than 92 substantive errors in his analysis. But if you look at the broad range of analyses that are there, they all kind of come in with moderate effect sizes to large effect sizes depending on the comparison. And when you look at the mediation, you look at those 60 studies that almost all report significant mediational effects, it appears as though about 50% of the follow-up outcomes, if you use proportion to variance accounted for by the mediator, are mediated. These are the first 18, and these are the effect sizes in terms of proportion mediated. I know that proportion mediated is not the ideal metric, by the way, but unfortunately the statisticians have yet to give us a better effect size estimate of mediation. So I think this is probably the best we can do until that statistical issue is worked out within the field. But using the cross product of the coefficients, which allows us to look at the direct and indirect pathways and how much of the variance is eliminated in the direct effects through the mediational process, we know that the weighted and unrated averages come up around 50% of the variance at follow-up is produced by the mediators you see at post. Now, I wanted to give just a few examples of things out there in the literature. A lot of these things you've seen if you're an ACT person. I do have one brand new study that just came out yesterday that I'll share with you. But the theme in these outcome studies is that across many areas, good outcomes are being achieved, but they're being achieved in ways that suggest that psychological flexibility is critical to the outcomes. Let me just review a few. This is one of the best studies. The Arch et al. Study in JCCP in 2012, 128 people, mixed anxiety disorders, is wonderful because it compares best of breed CBT done at the home department of the person who developed it and is supervising the therapist, Michelle Krask's lab at UCLA. And it compares it to ACT, being supervised from Reno by phone calls from my graduate students, certainly not getting any special buy-in or bias of the therapists. And we took an ACT-based approach or a CBT approach, and we combined it with exposure and mixed anxiety disorders. Exposure is part of ACT. The only reason it was ever excluded was for political and scientific reasons, which is I thought people would not listen to us if we did the studies with it included. And I'm glad we're past that era, and it's time to include it. So here we're asking, here's this key component of exposure. Is it best to wrap it inside a CBT rationale with traditional CBT skills, or in the third wave rationale and third wave or ACT skills, focused on psychological flexibility? We did a better job of producing psychological flexibility. This is true on the AAQ. It's true also on the diffusion measure we used and some of the components of flexibility. And this is on blind clinical interviews, the best quality data in this study, from pre to post in this 128-person sample. CBT and ACT, and both with exposure, were exactly the same. But once you stopped treatment, the CBT and exposure methods stopped improvement, and the ACT methods continued to improve. The Cohen's D of that difference from post to 1 year follow-up is more than a standard deviation. I challenge you to find a high-quality study done by a gold standard CBT method, even by the developer of that method, even in that person's shop, where anything else has been able to beat it by more than a standard deviation. It never happens, but it did happen. And it means something that we were able to continue to see improvement in the ACT participants. We now know in the studies that have followed that this treatment here was mediated by psychological flexibility and especially by cognitive diffusion, and that was true in both conditions. It was just especially true in ACT because we were targeting it. I think that's wonderful to learn that, for example, doing thought records, learning to write down and look at your thoughts, works in part by cognitive diffusion. It allows us to now modify these traditional methods in a way that's directed by the process instead of by the old process of direct cognitive change, which did not mediate the outcomes. That's progress. And whether it's called ACT or CBT, I'm fine with it. It's good for people, and we're all moving forward. The same thing has been shown in pain. This was done by Lance McCracken in a recent study. I knew this was coming because I had seen this in a dissertation we did 20 years earlier, when we had developed the first version of the chronic pain acceptance questionnaire that Lance had found, David Geiser's dissertation done here at UNR 20 years ago. In this study, he found that what mediated the outcomes in traditional CBT included acceptance. And in fact, it was a particularly good mediator of the proportion of pain interference benefits that came from CBT, with effect sizes that were much larger than social support, life control, affective distress, or other mediators that were examined. That same theme is there in other ACT or randomized trials. This is a 1 year follow-up of a combined set of data from Brandon Gaudiano's testing of ACT versus TAU with the chronically mentally ill and Patty Bock's data. And it showed at 1 year a positive effect on rehospitalization. These are the survival curves. That was fully mediated by post measures of cognitive diffusion from positive psychotic symptoms. This is a study on depression and thriving. I like it because it isn't just a matter of getting rid of symptoms, it's a matter of creating lives that are worth living. And in this study done by Ernst Bollmeyer and his crew in the Netherlands, he found that ACT produced increases in flourishing as defined by emotional well-being, psychological well-being, and social well-being, and it was fully mediated by changes in psychological flexibility. These are the percentages in flourishing that he saw in this randomized trial, and you can see a much higher level of flourishing at post and at follow-up produced by psychological flexibility changes. This is a very exciting randomized trial that was published a little more than a year ago in JCCP, comparing ACT to group support in batterers. If you know the literature on battering interventions, you know that the effect sizes on actual physical aggression and domestic violence approximate 0. There was a recent Cochrane review that concluded that even CBT, or the Duluth method based on feminist theory, is basically inert when it comes to changing the physical aggression of domestic violence batterers. This nice decrease, these are partner reports as well as individual reports. I'm going to show you the new data here in just a second, which I think is even more exciting, with a large effect size, was mediated by psychological flexibility as measured by the EAQ and the DERS. These are the new data. This is a replication with court-adjudicated batterers, basically everybody coming through the court system in Iowa. They were able to look at the arrest records of the entire state of Iowa, and because of that, they could assign people either to the Duluth model plus CBT, which is the most common thing that batterers get in the U.S., basically feminist theory plus changing your thoughts so as to change your violence, versus ACT. And these are the actual charges. These are the behavioral outcomes. Do people get charged with crimes? And you can see 24% less over the next year with a 5-session group protocol based on ACT in any charge, 31% less with domestic assault, and 37% less on any violent charge. There is nothing in the literature like this. And given that we know that the earlier effects were mediated by psychological flexibility, I'm excited to wait for the next study, which Amy Zarley tells me is coming as she analyzes the mediational data on these results. This is one out of diabetes. I mention it only because it's come under high criticism, actually by someone in my department. Long story that. Showing that a very short ACT protocol could lead to much better diabetic control and self-management, and that it was fully mediated by changes in psychological flexibility specifically focused on diabetes. You should know, I didn't take the time to put together the chart, but just about a month ago in PLOS One, a very large and well-done study out of Iran replicated this study fully. All of the effects replicated very nicely in a much larger sample. We've seen these kinds of effects in things like ACT for OCD. This was published, this is the Mike Tuhig dissertation published in JCCP about 3 or 4 years ago, or maybe a little more. But these are now the degree to which outcome predicts process. We found that the psychological flexibility mediated outcomes, but I wanted to show you a picture of what that looks like when you look at people across time. The comparison condition here was relaxation training. And what you can see is that in relaxation training, the outcomes predict the processes as much as the processes predict the outcomes when you lagged correlations across sessions. So what we're doing here is we're taking session by session measures, and to the extent we can do it in an 8-week or 9-week protocol, we can go about 4 lags out and have enough data. We can look at the strength of the lag correlations. Of course, they all go down because as it gets farther away in time, it's harder to predict. But in all cases, ACT processes predicted outcomes better than the other way around. Several studies have looked at the moderation of ACT and other methods such as CBT. And it fits what we know of psychological flexibility. For example, Joanna Arch and Michelle Krask have now published 2 or 3 studies that appear to show that ACT is better with multi-problem patients. A recent interesting examination of actual dropout said that ACT was better for those who, quote, do not perceive having control over internal anxiety states. And so the model is fitting psychological flexibility. And I think I can say to clinicians here is if you have a little baby bouncy's case, if you have an easy case, a simple case, a straightforward case, you may not need a full ACT protocol or any of the third wave methods. Frankly, the traditional behavioral methods will probably do just as well or better. But if you have complex cases and multi-problem cases, if you have chronic cases, it's time to reach into the toolkit of the third wave. We know that ACT and psychological flexibility impacts practitioners too. It isn't just the clients. We have several studies that show that. We know that it lowers burnout, increases a sense of personal accomplishment, for example, in psychologists, psychology trainees, in nurses, medical students, trainee social workers, addiction counselors, and so on. But it isn't just your sense of burnout and accomplishment. It's a change in how you work as a practitioner. This is a study that published a little more than a year ago, showing tapes of anxiety disordered clients and asking people to do treatment planning and decide how much exposure they would recommend for their clients. Psychological flexibility of the therapist correlated significantly with the amount of time they were willing to plan to do exposure. I think if you think of your own students or colleagues, you've seen this. People say, oh no, I'm not going to do that because when they're talking about evidence-based procedures, and and the data show, it's not because of what they say, it's because of their psychological flexibility in being able to mount these procedures. It's hard to do exposure. It's emotionally hard on the therapist. But we're not here for our betterment. We're here for our clients' betterment. This is another study we published in JCCP a few years ago with drug and alcohol counselors using ACT as a front end before we train drug and alcohol counselors on the science of drug abuse treatment, focused in particular on agonists and antagonists. Many people in drug abuse treatment don't want to use agonists and antagonists because they say things like, that's not how I got sober, or I don't want to use drugs to treat drugs. Well, excuse me, but the science is too good. If you have a heroin addict, it makes far more sense to be thinking about methadone, whether you're comfortable or not. And what we found is if we did an ACT workshop before we trained them, a 2-day ACT workshop and then training in the science of substance abuse treatment, an interesting pattern happened. They actually admitted afterwards to more worries about what their colleagues would think if they recommended methadone, for example, with their clients. but those thoughts were less believable. So the clinician said, yeah, people might not like it more, but they also said, and that's just a thought, more. And they actually recommended the use of agonists and antagonists more in checked client reports. We found that this effect was mediated by changes in psychological flexibility, especially the diffusion from thoughts about what others would think and the barriers to using this in their clinics. I just want to wave my hand at the link to our underlying biology. We have a new study showing that psychological flexibility appears to be an endophenotype for the relationship between the SERT gene, the 5-HTT gene, transporter gene, and depression. A controversial area that gives confusing results, and the reason is that the effects of these short alleles are actually gathered together in a different way if you're psychologically flexible versus inflexible. We're now doing pre and post fMRI studies showing differences in the underlying neurobiological response based on the psychological flexibility changes that interventions produce. So here's my bottom line, just 3 minutes left. I'm sorry for that, but this is what I want to say. Progress in a process-based account, which is where I think our field now needs to go in the post-DSM era, requires a model that is integrated with basic research and that has powerful, broadly applicable processes that are focused on changeable events. I would argue that psychological flexibility is such a model, and it's not confined to ACT. I think it applies across the board, helps us understand how the therapeutic relationship works, how the impact of some of our traditional procedures work, and it gives us new procedures to follow. I think that ACT, RFT, psychological flexibility, and CBS are logical next steps forward in behavioral psychology. I view them as an extension of traditional behavior analysis and kind of a rebirth of that tradition. But where it's led us in clinical work, in process-focused, evidence-based care, is a logical next step for all of applied psychology. And I think that the CBS approach and the CBS community can help show the way, even for those who are not interested in ACT per se, or do not consider themselves part of that community. So that's what I came to share with you, and I probably don't have time to take questions, but if you want to give you some, I'm happy to take them now. And somebody might want to turn up my speakers because I can't yet hear you. Well, thank you for the applause.